now. Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, Amos Zweig is back here and we're having a conversation about some problems and issues in the Western world, or you could perhaps argue the whole world, that we face today. And we've been talking about multiple things, China and governmental developments, political developments, and also technology. For instance, smartphones and developments concerning smartphones and Google, and some rather scary potential concerning tracking is also something we could discuss. So yes, Amos, what do you think about perhaps we could continue the thought about smartphones. You could also start off by talking generally what you think about smartphones as we use them today, perhaps positive sides, negative sides, and then the concrete thing about tracking, which you talked about.
Yes, thank you very much, Christoffer. Yes, so of course everybody knows what the smartphone is today. Almost everybody has one. It's kind of like a small computer basically that you can carry in your pocket, and I use my smartphone now for almost everything. I have my address book in there, and I use some Excel sheet on Dropbox. I take notes when I have an interesting idea. I do that with my smartphone. If I have my cooking recipes on some folder on my smartphone. So basically I use my smartphone just about for everything all day long, and it's always with me in my pocket. And so of course, as this already shows, it has a lot of useful advantages in day-to-day life, because it makes very many things easier. If you want to go someplace, you just put it in Google Maps and it tells you the way. All kind of this stuff, you know it yourself. So just this morning, I kind of had a realization though about how scary and crazy this actually also is. Because I remembered, I think it's now about 9 months ago, there was this big discussion in Switzerland, and I think also in other countries, about the contact tracing because of the coronavirus. And so different governments started to develop contact tracing apps. And also, for example, Google developed a contact tracing app. And as a friend pointed out to me, it already installed this contact tracing app on every smartphone, on every Android phone, through its regular software updates. So you didn't even notice, just one day as your smartphone was making a software update, this program which allows now this contact tracing was installed as a part of your operating system on your smartphone, if you have an Android phone. Now it was deactivated, so you would have to activate it manually if you wanted to use it, but still it just shows that this possibility exists. And I thought this morning that basically I have no idea about all the small things that the operating system of my smartphone does. When does it access the microphone? When does it access the GPS? Where does it send all of these informations? I don't know. I just kind of hope that it only does what I want it to do. But since, for example, Google is growing larger and larger, it starts that I'm actually not very trusting towards Google anymore. I feel that they are getting a bit too powerful. And in that sense, I just realized how crazy it actually is that I have this device on me all the time, and I don't really fully know what it's doing, and I don't really fully trust the company that is creating and updating this software system. So maybe that's a start into the problematic side of smartphones.
Yes, yes, very good. And as you point out, smartphones are very heavily used today. You use them a lot, and I also use mine to a significant degree. And there are efficient things concerning smartphones. It's very easy to do things, as you point out, but also you have this potential for massive control. And this tracking feature, which you talked about, it's something that is being integrated into the operating system, we might say, though it is something you can deactivate. And that's a good thing, of course, that you can deactivate it. But you still see that, okay, there is a potential. Now Google has a way of accessing information about smartphones and the persons who are owning and using them. And even though that is something you can deactivate, still the power is present, the potential is present. And who knows what Google can try to do in the future, try to change or manipulate something in order to actually gain access. I'm not sure how they would do it, because they would still try to claim that no, they should respect our privacy. But still, perhaps they will try to in some way tempt us to just accepting more and more control in the name of efficiency. And that's a scary thought. And also, I think that a problem with Google, and when it comes to trusting Google, we also talked about the trust a little bit earlier and how trust itself is very important. But when it comes to Google specifically, they have generally this framework or philosophy of society, of mankind, which is not exactly a vision that would be very, you could say, traditional and natural and necessarily respect privacy so much. It seems like Google has this vision of a very technocratic society where technology sort of encompasses everything, and where people are sort of integrated into a all-encompassing digital system, similar to how Mark Zuckerberg talked about the potential metaverse in the future. Now, I don't know for sure whether any Google person has come out and argued this, but I suspect that they have this general philosophy in mind, similar to Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, etc. And when you have a company who has another philosophy than you do, or I do, or someone else, that could create real problems in the future about what they will try to do through their products and way they would try to advertise their programs. So that's a general thought that I had in mind. What do you think about this?
Yes, I think you brought up a couple of good points. The first thought that I had is, of course, just because it says in your operating system that you can deactivate the tracking doesn't mean at all that it's actually deactivated. So there is this kind of, I don't know if you wanted to call it a proverb or a rule of thumb, but whatever can be done will be done. And I think this is very true. And if you just look at, there have been many instances in the past of, for example, states spying on their own citizens. So governments spying on their own citizens and denying it for years. And then when the proof was finally there, they basically said, okay, so we were spying on you. And so now shut up and continue like nothing happened. And people just shut up and life goes on. So one example was this scandal when it turned out that the US government was spying on the German government. They had like these directional microphones pointed at the building from the American embassy, pointed at the building where the German government was having their conversations. And they denied it. And then basically in the end, they said, okay, yeah, so we did it, but what will you do about it? So whatever can be done will be done. And I don't see necessarily why Google, I'm certain they are tempted to collect some GPS information from your phone or some contact tracing from some people's phone, just to test if the system really works. So they will say, well, we are not using the data and it's kind of anonymized, so we don't know which person is who. We are just trying to test our system. And of course, everything will be deleted, but you don't know if that's true. You will just have to take their word for it. And even if they delete it on one server, they might have a different server where the data is still on there. And so that's a big problem, I think. And the second thing that you brought up, which is a good point, I think, is the vision or the philosophy of these companies. And if someone has a different vision or a different philosophy, they will also have a different understanding of good and evil in the end, of what is okay to do and what is not okay to do. And it seems that sometimes people who have a very grand vision, like we want to change the entire world and make like this technocratic paradise, well, then some people might think that it's okay to harm some little privacy rights of some individuals here and there, because the end justifies the means. And so I think, yeah, we could go into this a little bit further about how this vision might affect their judgment and their behavior also.
Yes, that's a good point. And though it is a little bit speculative, because I haven't looked into what the leaders at Google would explicitly say about this, but when you see in the general tendencies about what they're doing, that reflects a way of viewing the world and viewing human nature, etc. And also when it comes to ways these companies try to gain access to people's information through various means, I'm thinking of YouTube using algorithms to sort of make it more adaptable, so that you will receive the videos that are more appropriate to your personal interests. And it might seem good that, yes, I want to look more at videos that are more interesting to me and less at those that I found boring. But those algorithms, though I'm certainly not an expert and I don't know really that much about it, but it seems to me that these algorithms is accumulating information about the subject and thus doing things based on that information. And that's a concerning thought, because then they gain access to what you like, what kind of videos you watch, etc. And those are generally private things. So you see this principle being manifested in this specific way. And it seems to be this general tendency that Google and other companies are advertising this idea that we want to make life easier for you, so you don't have to worry about this and that and the other thing. So that when you look at your shop, you will automatically see the things you want. When you're trying to find a way to get to this place, you'll automatically have the information you need, etc., to make life easier. But under this pretext, in reality, they'll gain more and more access to you as a subject. And that's the negative side of this, which is sort of try to be accepted through this pretext of making life easier. And it seems like people are generally accepting this. Like, as you said, they can accept that the government has been spying on them, but okay, it doesn't really harm me in any physical way or anything like that. People might perhaps think, and I'll just continue on. So that might be the case with Google and YouTube. And also one thing I could also mention is this gradual ceasing of using physical money. and the development of just using credit cards. Some people who say this is very efficient, it makes things a lot easier, but the negative side is that, well, first of all, things become less natural and more, you could say, digitalized, and I don't think that's very healthy for human beings. And also it creates a vast information system where you can gain access to what people buy in a very totalitarian manner. So we see this tendency to totalism, if totalism can be used as a term here, and that is scary. Yeah.
Yes. I think this is also an important thing that you brought up in this context. This algorithms that start to understand people's interests and giving them specific recommendations. And the point is, as you said, it makes life easier. It's kind of also, it can be comfortable, it can be useful, it can be efficient, but at the same time, somebody is collecting information about you. And if you think about it, if you can go on Google and look at your search history, and you can also go on YouTube and look at your YouTube history on the videos that you watched. And if you would think about taking this information, maybe let's just say from the last year. So there are a lot of search entries and there are a lot of YouTube videos that you watched, and you would give this list just to some random person, you would certainly feel uncomfortable about that. And if you think about how well you could actually understand the interests and the thought processes of a person, if you just have this list, then you will start to see a little bit, this is one more thing that Google knows about you. So yes, for example, I don't know, you Google, maybe you are a little bit scared about some global financial collapse, and so you Google that, and you Google that often, and so already you can be put in one category, and then maybe, yeah, you understand the idea. So I think that's a very, very important point here. And there is this image of the golden cage where you are in a very comfortable surrounding and you have everything that you need, but you are no longer free to go out of this surrounding. And I think this golden cage mentality is kind of growing very strong in our society. So a lot of people are perfectly happy to just put themselves into a golden cage and say, oh, I don't care if Google knows everything about me, or I don't care if my bank knows all of my payments, or I don't even care if the government knows all of these things, because hey, I have nothing to hide, and all of these services, they make my life more comfortable, which is the golden aspect of the golden cage, and so they are happy with it. But what they don't understand is that this very old or very often quoted quote by, I think, was it Benjamin Franklin? I'm not sure. A society that will give up a little bit of freedom for a little bit of security or comfort will lose both and deserve neither. And so I think when you sit yourself into the golden cage, then at some point the cage will stop being golden, and then it will just be a cage, and now you have a problem because now you cannot get out anymore. And I think it's a great problem that people are willing to give up responsibility to do things for themselves, even if it is less efficient or more uncomfortable, and you have to do some research by yourself instead of just receiving all the funny videos. But you have to pay some price for having your freedom and your independence, and many people are not willing anymore to do it.
Yes, that's a very good point. And the term golden cage, that's a good analogy to explain this sad phenomenon. And it reminds me very much of the novel Brave New World, which talks about this dystopian scenario where people are heavily controlled by a state, a very totalitarian state, but they live in comfort. They have these pleasure pills that are called Suma that they take in, and thus they have this experience of comfort. And I just use that whenever they feel dissatisfied and unhappy. And they are very heavily controlled, but they are living in comfort. So it's an interesting. There are similarities to the very famous novel 1984 by George Orwell. That yes, it is a very strictly controlling state, but contrary to 1984, people are experiencing this convenience and comfort, so that they will probably comprehend that they are very much controlled, but they are living comfortable lives. So they are actually accepting it. And it seems that society is moving more in the direction of Brave New World than 1994. And that's a scary thought. And especially if you do that in a gradual way, then people will just adapt more and more to this new situation. And people in general are accepting controls today that people 100 years ago would not accept at all, but we have gradually adapted to this. This is true in multiple ways when it comes to technology and privacy, and also the amount of bureaucracy and taxation and personal information that the state will have about you, etc. And that's sad to witness this. And it is, and even though it's comfortable, it doesn't really make a person happy, because a person has very much a need for beauty and for love and the natural. So this, for instance, this scenario where you have kids growing up with a beautiful garden, and they have the woods that I can run out to and play in the evening, which was very common back in the days, will today be more and more replaced by children having iPads and computers and cell phones, and they'll just watch videos on that or play video games. We have an enormous gaming culture today of young people. Very, very common, this gaming culture. And it's replacing more and more this traditional natural way of living. And this is in line with this vision that technocrats want to implement. So it's a scary phenomenon. And luckily there are people who are reacting against it and living more traditional lives. But there are still, the masses are still moving more and more in that direction.
Yes, yes, and I think one part of the reason why the masses are moving in this direction is because people have become, there is so much wealth, and people have become very, how do you say, they want kind of perfect security, because we are very rich, and so we should be able to eliminate all negative things, because what else should you do if you have a lot of money and a lot of capability? And so if you would say no, the government or the police shouldn't put cameras in the streets and film every corner of every street, then some people might say, well, but there will be more crime. And then if you reply, yes, but that's a sacrifice that we should be willing to take in order to have our privacy, to conserve our privacy, then people will disagree, because they are no longer willing to give any sacrifice whatsoever for conserving something. They want perfect security, and so whenever, for example, there is a car accident somewhere, then immediately the government comes and puts up a warning sign in this place and reduces the speed that you are allowed to drive, just because one person died there. And people say, oh, every death is a tragedy and every death is one too many. Yes, I don't want people to die, but if you want to make everything perfectly safe, then it will be also perfectly controlling, and you will not have any freedom to breathe or to behave or to act in ways which are not predefined, because everything has to be perfectly safe. And so I think that's a big part of the problem here. And also, perhaps one thing that could be said about, you said, for example, digital money, which is which creates a huge pot of information, which can then be used for all kind of totalitarian means. For many technologies that exist today, there would also be alternatives which are very much better with concern to privacy and to individual freedom. So, for example, people could use digital currencies like cryptocurrencies like Monero, which are not traceable. So Bitcoin is traceable and many cryptocurrencies are traceable, but there are a handful which are absolutely not traceable. So nobody knows where you send the money to. But the sad thing is that many people, they don't care about conserving their privacy. They just don't want to have extra effort. And so they will just take the most convenient option and never even think about, does this destroy my privacy and would there be an alternative?
Yes, that's a good point. And this mentality that we have this problem of crime or terrorism or something else, so we need to enforce strict measures to prevent that. That's it seems to be a very prevailing mentality, but it's destructive because it ignores the decreasing amount of privacy in people's lives. And also an example of this is gun control, that when there happens a tragic outcome, for instance, in the United States, where a madman shoots people and kills people through shooting, people will campaign for massive gun control. But that's not the solution, when in the sense that people also have guns and use them for good things, and people neglect very much this aspect when it comes to gun control issue and control in general, and police cameras, etc. And yes, that's a sad development, indeed a sad development. And it is something you see generally, also not just in one country, but generally in the West and in the world as well. And it seems like the West is also, to some degree, whether consciously or unconsciously, copying China to a certain degree. China is, of course, very strict when it comes to control, and they have this social credit system where people will make sure that others don't do anything bad, because then they will just have this credit system, so that will give them bad points and something like that. And that's a very strict way of controlling people. And the West doesn't have that, but it seems like it is, perhaps not deliberately, but in practice it seems like it is copying slight aspects of that in an increasing degree. And that's also scary to think about. And also one thing I could say is that many people, when it comes to this mentality of we need control to prevent crime and all that, seems to think in this way of having a dichotomy between either you have these big companies or the state controlling lots of things, or else there will be no control whatsoever. But that's completely false. You have different kinds of civil non-governmental institutions which are very useful and valuable and natural, like the family is a good way of helping people. If you have a family and you do economic transactions through that family, that's a way of controlling economic activity in that sense. You can have civil organizations of different sorts, which can have their internal control in a natural and traditional way. But today you have sort of the state, and then there's just the individual. So either the state controls things, or there is no control for the individual whatsoever. So there is this false dichotomy, and it ignores all the intermediaries in society, which works as healthy and natural controls in a good way. And yes, this denial of the principle of subsidiarity is very problematic.
Yes, I think that's a good point that you brought up here, with this notion that either the state controls something or it is not controlled at all. And it is, as you said, a very big problem that the principle of subsidiarity it doesn't exist anymore really in Western societies. It only exists on paper. So on paper, there is a lot of, yes, subsidiarity, but in the end, if the national government says otherwise, then what the national government says is what happens. And so that's not subsidiarity. So, and also one thing that should be pointed out is that in different cases, it is also it's actually far more useful to involve the citizens into solving a problem. So just an example, instead of putting cameras everywhere, you can also just make people stronger and more aware of a certain problem. So for example, in Israel, there used to be at a certain time a lot of terrorist attacks where terrorists would place some suitcase in a bus station, and then when a lot of people waited for a bus, they would blow up a bomb in this suitcase and kill these people. And so what the government did is it launched a wide campaign that everybody should watch out for unattended bags and call the police if they see an unattended bag. And this basically solved the problem, because people were very motivated and helping in this way. And so all the unattended bags were immediately spotted, and then somebody called the police. And so a similar thing is what happens in certain states in the US, where there is this idea of concealed carry, so that certain people who have kind of passed a test that they are not madmen, they are allowed to carry a concealed gun in public. And what this does is, if somebody wants to commit a crime, these people can intervene right there on the spot, instead of having to call the police and wait for 5 to 15 minutes before it arrives, in which time the crime has already happened. And so, yes, I think gun control is a big topic. It's in Europe, it's already crazy how far it has advanced, and also how far the people have absorbed this narrative. So if you say here that you think we should have less strict gun control, and that you would want the right to own a gun or even to carry a gun, you would be looked at as if you are a complete madman. Like, are you a psychopath? Do you want to kill somebody? But people don't understand, as you said, that guns are mostly used for self-defense and not for crimes. So yeah, that's a very sad topic in Europe in general. Maybe just a small note on this topic. George Orwell, which many people like, he made a very great quote once. He said, "The gun hanging on the wall of the simple worker, like the hunting gun, is the most secure, is the thing that secures democracy." So it's kind of the Second Amendment idea, but people in Europe have long since not understood this anymore.
Yes, that's very true. This practice that you can have small communities being able to defend themselves is more and more gone, because now it's more and more the state's responsibility to defend everyone. And you also see the lack of subsidiarity in that regard as well. And it's very problematic and inefficient. Because there is so much problems in Norway, for instance. There is so many problems with the police being so inefficient at preventing crime and doing something when a crime is committed. So many cases which are just basically ignored because they don't have the resources, and so much problems with that. So we see that it's not natural or healthy at all for this amount of responsibility, and yet that is the increasing tendency, and that's an unfortunate development. And this ideal of independence, that should really be the ideal that people should be pursuing, that you are actually able to do things through your family or through your local community or some other way of social organization on your own, instead of relying so much on the state. Or on big companies like Google and Facebook and other big tech companies. That should really be an ideal that people should strive toward, because that is what these companies and the state does not want. They don't want to have people be independent in various ways. So, for instance, if you can have your children to be independent of all this social media, for instance, and be able to be independent of them and do something else on their free time, like running out in the woods and playing like they used to do back in the day. That would be a way of rejecting this amount of control that these companies are sort of gradually offering, but in practice imposing in this problematic way on people through gradual adaptation. And try to make sure that you can accumulate capital in various ways on your own. And when it comes to technology, I think it would be healthy to have less of this very modern electronic technology in your presence. That, for instance, if you have a person who says, I don't want to own a smartphone because I don't like all the potential control and actual control going on there, so I'm going to have this traditional cell phone, which is what you can sort of put together and then open, and you will click physically to write things. People would look at that as being old-fashioned and perhaps primitive, but it's something that it's better when it comes to not being controlled by Google and other companies. It's a way of reacting against that and living a more natural life. I think that tendency is a good tendency, and people should strive more toward.
Yes, I think I just thought something when you talked about small communities being able to defend themselves and people being more independent, which I think in the past this was more the case, that people understood themselves as a community, that if they have a problem, they come together and they solve it by themselves. This is the mentality which actually built up the Western societies. People who were individually strong and competent and solved problems by themselves. And I think what happens today is that it's, as you said, it's wanted by the government and by huge companies that people should be less and less independent, because they should be more and more dependent on the state and on the big companies, because that way you can control them, which gives the state power, or that way they will have to come back and always buy your products, which gives the large companies income. And of course, also in Europe, for example, if someone breaks into your house and you shoot them, then you will be severely punished. Even though the other person broke into your house, they didn't have to come into your house, but they did so voluntarily. But if you will defend yourselves with a firearm, you will be severely punished. And I think what is part of the motif behind this is to keep people vulnerable and afraid, because then they will be much more willing to support very drastic increases of state surveillance and of state activity, because they have a very increased desire for security. If you feel competent that you can defend yourself, then you are not so much in need of a lot of state surveillance. So I think that's an important point. And the other thing that you said, that these technological gadgets or this technological way of life is kind of offered to us, but also kind of imposed almost on us. I think you mentioned the social credit system, and I think that the kind of the vision of these technocrats is not very different from a social credit system. Because if you want to use technology to create a perfect world where only the good guys can buy whatever, and for example, a car, because the bad guys could use the car to run over someone, or only the people who have a responsible way with alcohol can buy a car, etc., then it kind of always goes into a direction of a social credit system. And so I think these people that have this technocratic vision, that believe with the perfect algorithms we can make this world a better place, they will have a kind of a tendency towards this this social credit system in one way or another.
Yes, that at least in practice, that is the result, and that's a scary thing. And also, one pretext under which this tendency is promoted is the climate change movement and activism, which is very much spread. And when the COVID crisis hit last year, it seems to have been sort of ignored to a certain degree, because now everyone was concerned about COVID. But now in the latter months, it seems like it has been somewhat back again at the agenda. And that's it's a strong movement, in the sense that there are so many people who are so afraid about what will happen to the climate if we don't do things right now, and create this fear, which is very extreme in some cases. And this extreme fear is very useful to justify government control, company control of individuals, under the pretext of making sure that your carbon footprint doesn't increase too much, for instance, and have heavy taxation that is imposed in very personal ways. And if you have this climate change ideology behind it, then you can sort of make people accept a lot of measures, because they think, oh, climate change is so serious. And so we also have this pretext, which is very much on the agenda in political and ideological affairs. When I listen to some political debates on mainstream media, like just before the election here in Norway, there was very much talk about the climate change, because the IPCC had just published a new report, and people said, oh, this is going to be more terrible than we previously thought. And politicians were all about, how can we ban this? How can we control this? How can we regulate this? So we see that this is a pretext for government control, and that's also a very problematic thing, because the whole climate issue is a very scientific issue. And how are we, who are not scientists, to relate to this when they say, well, all the scientists agree, and therefore you have to justify this government control? It's a problem, because many people don't necessarily know the science behind what is actually true and false. So that's also an issue. And yeah, and there are also other things like we talked about crime, terrorism, which is being justified, used to justify more control. But I think there's at least potential for more people to resist this in these ways, that you are less dependent on modern technology, that you can do things more on your own, be more of a capital owner than just dependent on the state. And I also could mention how this idea that you are mastering capital and mastering money is a way of resisting the system. Like Robert Kiyosaki, the famous author of Rich Dad Poor Dad, talked about how the school system, for instance, is making you more and more dependent. It's teaching you to become dependent on the system. And the corporate economy or the state sector, it doesn't teach you how to become an entrepreneur, how to accumulate capital, how to invest, how to have stocks and bonds and things like that. And that's very unfortunate, because if you are this person who can sort of master money and invest and make capital on your own, that's another way of being more independent from the state and big companies. But the schools are not teaching this because they have another ideological framework. So that's also another way you could sort of hopefully offer people a way to be more independent.
Yes, that's also an interesting point. If you are very good in school, then you will be a good employee. So you are taught everything you need to know so that you can later have a job and work for somebody else. But you are not necessarily taught how to be financially independent. And it goes to the same thing we have said before. Governments and big companies don't want people to be independent. They want them to be dependent on themselves. And so also one thing that I have always thought, which might have been one part of the motivation behind all of these crazy corona regulations, is that there was exactly the desire to destroy people with financial independence. So you have a guy who owns a restaurant, and now you change the laws 20 times in 2 years, and you force basically people to stay at home and not go to his restaurant. And after 2 years, this person is ruined and has to sell his restaurant. And then some huge company comes and buys it. And then it becomes one more Molino Pizza or whatever the brand Burger King that you have, which is a huge chain which owns thousands of restaurants in different countries. And these huge companies, they can survive such a time of pressure where the regulations change, because they have specific lawyers that are hired only to comply with government regulations. But a simple person who owns their own restaurant, they have to work in their restaurant the whole day, so they cannot read government regulations the whole day, and so they are forced out of business. And I think that's something that was kind of deliberately done in the last couple of years now, and it's a very, very destructive thing for the stability of our societies. And also one thing that you mentioned, which I think is a good point, was the pretext. So climate change is an important pretext, or crime and terrorism, or child pornography. These are pretexts that are always used to justify different measures. But no matter what the problem is that is posed as a pretext, the solution is always the government getting more control over something. The solution is never, okay, make individuals stronger, make individuals more independent so that they can defend themselves better against these kinds of problems. And so when the problem always changes, but the solution always remains the same, then there is some hidden motivation which is not really talked about. And I think it's really important that, or I don't actually know the solution, but many of these things are justified with some pretext where you create fear in people, and then you can do, or these governments or huge corporations get what they actually want, which is more control.
Yes, that's That's true, and also very good point to bring up the COVID crisis, which I didn't consider, but of course, the COVID crisis itself is a very heavily used pretext for massive government controls, like the lockdowns, which have been so severe that I can't think of anything in recent history which have had similar kinds of lockdowns as we've had in 2020 and until this year. Not even in wartime, in World War I and World War II, not even then there were controls like the lockdowns that we had during the COVID crisis. And yes, the massive pressure and controls, and as you mentioned, people just trying to run a business is now like there was a person in the United States who ran the business and was arrested because he didn't follow the COVID regulations. And it's very strong control, and also the mask mandates, multiple places that people have been arrested just for not wearing mask in very strict manner. And it's saddening to see how much control has been used under the pretext of this COVID spread narrative. So that's very sad, and you also see how these controls are not directed toward evils which should really be defeated, but rather at people just doing regular things like going to work and running a business. There are things that are truly evil, but that the government doesn't do really anything about, like pornography. It's a very massively used evil thing that many people are using, but that's not being banned, for instance. But when it comes to people running a business or working, well, that's severely controlled. So there is this control is not directed toward where you could justify control, and that's a very sad thing to think about.
Yes, I think it's interesting because I'm not sure if I would exactly agree that pornography is an evil, though I would certainly agree that it has a couple of huge problems that are never really talked about. But however you think about this, the interesting point is that things which make individual human beings more strong and independent and self-reliant, these things are specifically targeted, whereas things which lead into the golden cage, these things are always even promoted. So of course, if people are working for a huge corporation and then in their free time they just watch pornography and play video games, then that's great, because it's much more easy to control them. Whereas if people are very financially independent, they have their own business, they are not don't have to rely on a corporation which pays them a salary, and they have perhaps a healthy relationship and they don't abuse. Because in my mind, pornography and games in excessive measure are a kind of drug, and if people are drug dependent, then they are weaker, because if you take their drug away, then they have a problem. And so yeah, it's just this idea that whatever leads into the golden cage, this is let very loose by the government, or even kind of endorsed, like also the use of marijuana. This is now soon to be legalized. But if you want to run your own business or defend yourself, then we will make it more and more difficult for you.
Right, exactly. So when you have things in life which people use as drugs, when it comes to things that are very hedonistic, it's about pleasure for yourself and being your own individual, isolated with this thing like video games or pornography. Those things are tolerated and sort of in line with a liberal philosophy that you as an individual should have your pleasures fulfilled, and the state is here to take care of you. But if you try to sort of master yourself and have this independence, well, that's another issue. So you see this ideological distinction sort of whether conscious or not conscious for the government, but that if you are simply doing things that are pleasurable to yourself, for your own ego in your isolated community, that's fine as long as you are dependent on the state. It's almost this view or framework in this liberal ideology. So I think that's of course a very destructive and inhumane way of looking at human beings and morality in society. But that seems to be the ideological framework for many of the governmental laws and mentalities that are in the West today.
Yes, and I would add that in the end, the people themselves are to blame that they follow this path. So if you choose to, I don't know, as you said, instead of improving yourself, just letting yourself go in the direction which poses the least resistance, then in the end, you yourself are to blame for this development. Or if many people in a society follow this path, then the society will fall apart, and then the people are kind of collectively to blame for this falling apart, because in the end, it's up to the people to tell their government that they should do good things and to not elect people who will do bad things. And if people are egoistic and short-sighted and only elect politicians that promise them a lot of free stuff, for example, then they will get what they deserve. So, yeah.
Right, exactly. So it is very important for people to combat this hedonistic way of life that people care about pleasure and things like that, and rather pursue virtue and ways of mastering yourself, self-control, and thus becoming more independent from the current system. So that's a very important principle that everyone needs to embrace, to combat this hedonism and liberalism and pursue virtue.
I think that's a very interesting conclusion, if you want to call it so, that we have reached here, because perhaps this is really the way to turn the whole thing around. If people would stop striving after this hedonistic path, like my life should be as pleasurable as possible and as easy as possible, and instead think, no, I want to do the good thing, not the comfortable thing, but the good thing. And I want to improve myself and become stronger and become more independent and become more capable of affecting the world, then this is kind of exactly the opposite development. And then you would also say, no, I don't just want my bank or Google to know everything about me, because I want to invest time and energy to find a way which preserves my privacy, because that gives me independence and that gives me strength. And all of these kind of problems that we've talked about seem in some way to be linked to people wanting to pursue just a easy and pleasurable life.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true. So I think to have this a way of life that values virtue and independence, and less about modern technology and more about using more natural means to live, and emphasize things like making your own capital, establishing a family, having marriage, private property, tradition, faith, the true faith, I would say. Those things are what people should value and emphasize. Those things are truly great means to combat modern statist and massive control and control of these big tech companies. So yes, I think that's a good conclusion for this conversation that we had today. So I don't know if there is any last remarks that you want to share before we end this conversation.
No, I think it's really a good conclusion. Perhaps we could make a video about marriage soon, because I think that's also a very important topic that gets a lot of bad press today, but it's actually, I think, a very, very good thing. So we could make a video about that. But other than that, I thank you for having this conversation. I think it was very useful and very interesting. And yeah, I have nothing really to add to it.
Yes, yes, indeed. Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Amos, for being on there to talk about these issues. So I wish you and the audience a great Wednesday.
Thank you, and same to you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.